everyone! Today I want to talk about the differences between auditory hallucinations, specifically internal auditory hallucinations, and an internal monologue. And I'll be speaking primarily through my lived experience with both of these things. I hear voices as part of my schizoaffective disorder, and I have an internal monologue because of my basic human condition. And if you are new here, my name is Kit, and I have schizoaffective disorder, which is a condition where someone experiences symptoms of schizophrenia, such as delusions and hallucinations, but also symptoms of a mood disorder, either major depression or, for me, bipolar. And so with that out of the way, let's get started. And the first thing I want to touch on is what exactly is an internal monologue, in case you don't have one yourself. In short, it's a term for a way of thinking that is done primarily in words and phrases, as opposed to nonverbal abstract thoughts that people who don't have an internal monologue might experience. Internal monologues are big on this thing called inner speech, where someone can play out phrases and conversations inside their head. And the words of that inner voice sounds like them. And that voice narrates their thoughts and actions throughout the day. For many, it's like having a stream of consciousness, much like you'd see in a piece of writing or poetry, or dare I say, even in anime. Although in real life, it's far less dramatic. Although if you do have a dramatic internal monologue, you have a very interesting life. And having an internal monologue can be extremely helpful because it helps people play out conversations in their head. It can be used to help with job interviews, for example. And the monologue for these people is familiar and comforting, and that's just how they think. And the characteristics of that monologue differ from person to person. Some people can think in full sentences or even paragraphs, which is how it is for me, while some people only think in single words or even just short fragments or phrases. It can be frequent for some and occasional for others. But overall, having an internal monologue is totally normal, totally natural, and it can be very, very helpful. But things get a little complicated when we put psychosis into the mix, specifically auditory hallucinations. And when those hallucinations come from inside the head, well, things get even more complicated. But what exactly do I mean by that? Inside the head? Well, there are actually two different kinds of auditory hallucinations. The first is external auditory hallucinations, where the person who hears voices is hearing them like they would hear another person. The voices are experiences coming from the outside, hence the term external. But internal auditory hallucinations tell a different and more complicated story. And this is the kind that I experience. Internal auditory hallucinations come from the inside and can be heard of as being similar to thoughts. And communication with those voices can also happen internally, meaning the psychotic person can use their inner voice to communicate with their voices. That's what I do. So you might be starting to see why this kind of psychosis can cause problems with someone who also has an internal monologue. So now that we've covered what each of these things is, I want to take a few moments to describe three key differences between internal auditory hallucinations and an internal monologue. The first thing is that psychotic voices typically sound different than a person's inner voice. Oftentimes, the internal monologue voice sounds very familiar to the person experiencing it, meaning it sounds like them. And while it is possible to have psychotic voices that sound like the person experiencing them, oftentimes psychotic voices come across as sounding foreign or different. Many of my own hallucinations sound very different from my own inner voice, which helps me differentiate between what's the schizo and what's the kitzo. And of course, people with psychotic disorders don't just hallucinate voices. I know I'm focusing on voices for this video, but it's important to note that people can also hallucinate knocks on the door, footsteps, things like that. And people with psychotic disorders can experience a wide variety of sounds when it comes to hearing voices. The hallucinations can sound like people they know, like family or friends, or even abusers. But they can also sound incoherent or foreign, like someone used a voice changer, for example. And they can appear as a single voice or as a multitude. And so if someone is experiencing hearing sentence fragments or other things that don't necessarily sound like their inner voice, then it could be psychosis. And I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but you might start to wonder, well, hey, if a voice in someone's head sounds like their own inner voice, what's next? And that's number two, because an internal monologue can be controlled. There are situations where someone's thoughts can move so fast that they can't keep up with them. The number one example for this would be mania or hypomania, or even panic or anxiety disorders. But I'm not going to talk about that in this video. But here's the thing, many psychotic people, me included, say that their voices narrate their thoughts and actions throughout the day, which sounds a lot like an internal monologue. But the key thing here is that someone with an internal monologue can make their inner voice be quiet and they can control what it says. Now, it might take meditation or other exercises to actually make someone's brain shut up, but at the end of the day, if it can be controlled, it's an internal monologue. It's not psychosis. Psychosis, on the other hand, cannot be controlled. For many, the voices will not quiet on their own. So if someone is wondering if they're hearing voices or if it's an internal monologue, if they can make the monologue stop, pause, or shut up, then it's not psychosis. The final thing has to do with communication. And this is one of the most helpful things for finding the difference between the two. And it's the fact that someone can't have a full-on conversation with an internal monologue, but they can if they're experiencing psychosis. Because when it comes to an internal monologue, there's not necessarily a conversation going on there. And I'm not talking about rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet, replaying conversations that have already happened, or rehearsing a talk for a conference in your head. I'm talking about a conversation that is very similar to that of a real person. It's a conversation where the psychotic person is talking to the level that they would be to another human being. And that being can have vocal mannerisms and a personality as well. In addition to having a unique voice. It can be very, very real. However, on the other hand, an internal monologue is basically someone talking to themselves, and it can't be conversed in the same way that I just talked about. And for me, part of being psychotic is experiencing this lack of control when I'm hallucinating. When I'm talking to a psychotic voice, I can't predict what they're saying because I don't know. I don't know what they will say next, I can only control what I say. And so the big thing for me is if I'm able to have a genuine conversation, then I'm dealing with a hallucination, not my internal monologue. But the last point I want to say, and this I say from the deepest level of my heart from personal experience, and it's that sometimes someone can't tell the difference between an internal monologue and an internal auditory hallucination. Voices can be cunning and they can trick you. And they can masquerade as you. They can. I mean, the whole thing about psychosis is that people have trouble telling whether it's real or not. And so sometimes I really can't tell the difference. Sometimes I don't know what's me and what's the psychosis. And in those moments, I sit there, I make my coffee, I listen to the cacophony of nonsense in my head, and when that coffee cools, I drink it, and then I get up and continue my day. And those are the 3 ways I tell the difference between the two if I can. And I know I am far from alone in experiencing this. And so if you're going through something similar and it's really intense and really frustrating and you feel like it's out of your control, talk to a doctor, talk to a therapist, and talk to your support system, and that will really help you cope. And of course, if you want to share, there is the comment section down below, and I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Schizoaffective, and I love talking to you guys about mental health. And as always, thank you for joining me and making the uncomfortable comfortable. I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.